Hello, dear viewers, and welcome to the program. I'm your host, Gunner. I know the production quality of this video isn't the best, but I'm working with what I've got. Now, before I get into this theory, I do just want to say that I wrote the majority of this video before John FNaF's latest video on the same subject came out. That video makes a lot of the same points that I'm going to in a second, but ultimately comes to some very different conclusions. I just wanted to make it clear that I used all of my own reasoning when writing this video. So, to finally get on to today's subject, Midnight Motorist. A very tired subject, I know, and to this day, probably the most vexing mystery of the original series. Ever since FNaF 6 was released almost 8 years ago, Midnight Motorist and its secret level later that night have largely remained a mystery. Anytime someone tries to come up with a definitive answer for what this minigame is actually trying to tell us, it just never quite fits and we're seemingly set back to square one.
I like that you're saying something golden, but you're saying that Funtime Freddy is the thing that captured her.
But the Funtime Freddy using an illusion disc to make him look like Freddy.
Now, most of what I think the basic setup of Later That Night is pretty standard. I'm not going to try to convince you that any of these characters are actually someone completely unexpected or anything like that. Instead, I want to give some of my own deductive reasoning for why I think these characters are who I think they are, and go into what I feel to be the ramifications of these characters being here. And a lot of it is based on who I believe the animatronic at the window is. In fact, that revelation is the whole reason I wanted to make this video. At the risk of sounding like the average clickbaity FNaF YouTuber, I think this single screen actually ties together a lot of the early timeline of the series. But to determine who these footprints belong to, we first have to deduce who all of the other characters are. We'll start with the player character. Most people can agree that it's William Afton, but what actual evidence is there to back that up? Well, there's the purple car, the fact that it's raining, and the title of the minigame itself, Later That Night, all suggesting that this is a depiction of William returning to his home after drunkenly murdering Charlotte Emily outside of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And I do think it's specifically Freddy's and not Fredbear's Family Diner, but I'll get into that later. The car the player drives in Later That Night is the very same as William's car in the Take Cake to the Children Death minigame from FNaF 2, which was the first depiction of Charlotte's murder. The second depiction of this event is the Security Puppet minigame from FNaF 6, in which we're shown the tire marks from William's car, invoking the only other reference to a car in the game, and that it was raining when Charlotte was murdered, just as it is in Later That Night. But if this is supposed to be William, then why isn't he depicted with a purple sprite as he is in every other minigame in all of the previous games? Well, William is purple in the first few games because Scott Cawthon wanted to depict him as this sort of shadowy, mysterious figure, but all of the backgrounds were already black, so he made a compromise and decided that shadows would be represented by purple. That's why William, Shadow Freddy, and these shadows cast by Fredbear and Spring Bonnie are all purple. But that's just the thing. This minigame is from William's perspective. He wouldn't view himself as a mysterious figure lurking in the shadows, he views himself as Spring Bonnie, the yellow rabbit. So, now that we have our player settled, we can move on to our other characters. The character sitting on the couch and the Runaway. Most people think that the character on the couch is either Mike or Mrs. Afton, and that the Runaway is either Mike or the crying child from FNaF 4, whom I'll be referring to as Dave for the remainder of this video. We'll start with the character sitting on the couch, as I feel like we've got a little more to work with here. In the past, I've been on both sides of the fence when it comes to who I think this is, but I've come to agree with the Occam's razor answer, Mike. If this was Mrs. Afton, then it would presumably be saying that she shared certain characteristics with Mike, namely the gray font color and a fondness for TV, which would make sense logically since she's his mother, but thematically, it would be completely pointless. Let's take a look at Mike's resemblance to his father in Sister Location, for example. Mike is said to look just like his father because that's how he views himself after the bite of 83. He believes he is just like his father, a monster. His flesh rotting away and turning purple, making him look just like William in the first 4 games, is a metaphor for how his guilt and the belief that he is just as bad as his father is literally eating away at him. Not to mention the fact that this only happens after Mike is forced to come face to face with and is literally filled by the consequences of his father's actions after being mistaken for him. only more confirmation for Mike that he is just like his father. And all of this works because we know a lot about William, so when we get this comparison between the two, we can infer what this means for Mike's character given what we know about him and his role in the story. Doing the same thing with Mrs. Afton, however, wouldn't work, because we don't know anything about her. We've never even seen her except for arguably a couple of vague representations of her in Sister Location. It wouldn't tell us anything about Mike's character, it wouldn't give us anything thematically, it just wouldn't work. Not from a meta storytelling perspective. To make a long story short, this is Mike. Which means that the Runaway has to be Dave, as there are no other male children in the Afton family. Now, Dave being the Runaway already has some pretty big ramifications for the early timeline. First, it means that Charlotte was the first death, not counting all the prequel stuff we'll be getting with Secret of the Mimic, which honestly isn't that out there with what we know about William. After all, he did murder Charlotte in the novel trilogy without much prior reasoning other than he's evil and crazy. I know a lot of people want William to have some more sympathetic or understandable motivations for his actions, i.e. killing Charlotte because he's a grieving father who blames Henry for Dave's death, but I personally don't agree. Now, I'm not saying that I don't think he had any motivations for what he did, I just think that his reasons were much pettier than most people seem to want to think. Serial killers aren't good people who just had one bad day and a fall from grace. There is something fundamentally wrong with how their brains work. Very often, they're narcissists or exhibit extreme antisocial behavior. This describes William to a T. We know that William was a technical genius. I mean, just look at the Funtime animatronics. These things are crazy advanced, and William built them with nothing but existing 20th century technology. No doubt, William was the best there was at what he did until he met Henry. If William was a technical genius, then Henry was a technical wizard. In the fourth closet, we're shown that Henry was capable of creating ridiculously lifelike androids in his home workshop.
I'm an android.
And again, with nothing but existing 20th century technology. It goes without saying that Henry's technical superiority over William massively bruised his ego. In the Silver Eyes, it was said that William held both a near religious admiration and a deep hatred of Henry, and this was basically all the motivation William needed to murder his child in cold blood. Now, while I do think that William was always capable of murder, I will agree that there should have been some extra reason that William chose to kill Charlotte. Some push, a final embarrassment from Henry to hurt William's ego, a straw that broke the camel's back. Instead, we don't get anything. He killed her because he's just evil. However, I think that the games actually do give us the thing that finally drove William to murder. The opening of the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. A lot of people think that this is Fredbear's because of how simplistic it is. It's literally just a square. But Scott's 8-bit minigames have never been completely indicative of the exact reality of these events. It looks simplistic in this minigame because it doesn't need to be anything more than this for what this minigame is trying to convey. Remember, Scott is an economic game developer. And think, would a restaurant as simplistic as Fredbear's have such a sophisticated babysitting robot as the security puppet? Plus, I really don't think Fredbear's had any characters other than Fredbear and Spring Bonnie. Anytime we've seen the place in action, it's always just those two. So if this is Freddy's and both Charlotte and the security puppet are here, then Henry is probably here too. He made the security puppet to keep an eye on Charlotte while he worked as the manager of the establishment. And this is exactly why I think William killed Charlotte. He was jealous. While Henry went off to be the manager of the new, popular Freddy Fazbear's, full of state-of-the-art animatronics of his own creation, William was left to manage the dumpy Fredbear's. Henry had bested him once again. Charlotte's murder wasn't revenge for Dave's death. William was getting back at Henry for being better than him. Now, if you'll remember, this section is actually supposed to be about Dave being the Runaway. So, other than Charlotte being the first death in the timeline, there is one more thing that this tells us. These footprints can't belong to Golden Freddy. However, I do think that they have to belong to a similarly spectral character. Spring locks would be triggered by the rain, and we know from Security Breach the week before that regular animatronics can't function for very long outside of their respective pizzerias without running out of power.
Freddy, it's open, let's go!
No, I cannot exit this facility.
Of course you can! Come on! We can hide you somewhere.
Without a recharge station, my systems would shut down within an hour. It is a safety precaution. It is my design.
This narrows it down to two characters, Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie. Now, personally, I actually don't think it can be Shadow Bonnie because I do believe that it was born from the agony of the DCI victims, due to its resemblance to Toy Bonnie and the fact that it doesn't seem to appear in any games or minigames set before FNaF 2. I also think that there might be a little more to Shadow Bonnie's creation that can be inferred from evidence found in FNaF 3, FNaF World, Ultimate Custom Night, and Security Breach, but that's way too much to go into now, so I'll save that for a future video. So if it isn't Shadow Bonnie, then that means there's only one other character that it could be, Shadow Freddy.
Hold up just a second, old sport.
I hear you saying?
There's no evidence that Shadow Freddy existed in 1983 either.
But there is, dear viewers. It's Nightmare. Like most things related to FNaF 4, there have been a lot of theories about just what exactly Nightmare is. MatPat theorized that Nightmare is the true form of the Nightmare animatronics without the effects of sound illusion discs, or hallucination gas, or whatever was creating the FNaF 4 nightmares. Personally, I believe that there's evidence that points towards something else. Within the FNaF 4 game files, Nightmare is labeled as Shadow Freddy. I don't think this is insignificant. Scott wouldn't do this just because they kind of look the same, especially since he knew that people would be digging through the game files. There's also Nightmare's dialogue from Ultimate Custom Night directed at William, "I am your wickedness made of flesh," and the fact that Nightmare's jumpscare in FNaF 4 is a throwback to Golden Freddy's jumpscare in FNaF 1, suggesting that Nightmare is more than just a regular animatronic. I believe that Nightmare is an early form of Shadow Freddy, formed from the agony produced by the Nightmare experiments and kept alive by William's own evil intentions. But if, in later that night, Dave has the gall to smash through a window to escape his bedroom, something the Dave we know from FNaF 4 definitely did not have the wherewithal to do, then I don't think he's experienced the Nightmare experiments yet. He hasn't yet been traumatized to the point that we see him in FNaF 4. Now, don't get me wrong. I do think that Dave was actually afraid of Fredbear's beforehand, which I'll get into later, but I don't think that anything other than the experiments would have scared him into the near vegetative state he's in FNaF 4. So if Dave hadn't been through the experiments yet, and Shadow Freddy really is a product of the experiments like I've theorized, then William must have already been experimenting on other people at this point in the story. Before William began to kill, before he started collecting and experimenting with Remnant, I think he was doing the same with Agony, and the Nightmare test chamber was an Agony farm. I'll get into how I think William learned about the existence of Agony towards the end of the video, but for now, I want to talk about how exactly he was apparently kidnapping people to use in his crazy torture experiments. Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. Let's think. How was William kidnapping kids to use in his Remnant experiments, the Funtime animatronics? I believe that the Funtimes, or at the very least some early prototype version of the Funtimes, were originally used to farm Agony, before William learned of the existence of Remnant. We don't know when the Funtime animatronics were created. If anything, the fact that there was a spring-lock suit at Circus Baby's Pizza World suggests that it was meant to be opened pretty early in the timeline before spring-lock suits were discontinued. We also don't know if the Funtime's method of collection, the big claw arm thing, was originally meant to be lethal or not. Elizabeth's death could have been a freak accident. Now, think back to what I said earlier, about why these footprints can't belong to a regular animatronic. They wouldn't have enough power to function outside of their pizzeria. So why would I think that the Funtime animatronics would be any different? Because the Funtime animatronics, or more specifically Funtime Freddy, is explicitly shown to be different. He has an extra power source. When the Twisted Ones was first released, the illusion discs described in the book were quickly associated with the power module seen on Funtime Freddy in Night 3 of Sister Location. At the time, it made sense. The power module was fairly conspicuous.
Freddy's chest pops open and the power module reveals itself. And it's this little blinking black dot, oddly unconnected to literally anything else in the animatronic, and in a pretty unusual place, just kinda stuck on, slightly off to the side.
And it did seem very similar to how the illusion discs are described in the novel. But then, a little more recently, with the release of the graphic novel adaptation of the Twisted Ones, the illusion discs actually had a design change to look more like little computer chips than the flat, round discs they're described as in the original novel. What if this was Scott's way of differentiating the two? Let me direct you to the infamous retcon issue post Scott made back in 2017, yet another tired subject. Don't worry, I'm not going to claim that this was the one retcon or anything like that. Instead, I want to point out a statement made in this post that I actually feel gets overshadowed by the whole one retcon thing. Here's an excerpt. The truth is that I've done one actual retcon in the series. There have been other times, however, when my original intentions didn't come across clearly. I used Sister Location to clear up a misconception from FNaF 4. Currently, there's a misconception from Sister Location that I may need to clear up someday as well, or maybe I'll just leave it to torment the fandom. Smiling winky face.
You motherfucker, Scott, you, when I get my hands on you.
What if the misconception that Scott's talking about was the belief that Funtime Freddy's power module was an illusion disc, and he later cleared it up by having the artist change the design in the graphic novel, showing the two to be different things altogether? So if this really is just a power module, then any given animatronic equipped with one is absolutely capable of roaming about freely and nabbing people to bring back to the nightmare test chambers.
Wait right there, old sport. Wouldn't that mean that the footprints in later that night could belong to a physical animatronic?
Well, yes, it's possible, but I still don't think that's the case for 3 reasons. 1, because I said so. 2, if William was able to program the Twisted Ones to search for a specific person in the novels, then he could probably program an animatronic to avoid certain people too, namely his own family. And 3, even if William didn't program the animatronics to avoid his family, why would William go through with the experiments after Dave was accidentally captured by his own animatronic? Did he just think, I was gonna punish him anyways, so I may as well torture him for days on end with nightmare robots? William is an abusive monster and definitely egotistical enough to think that he could get away with it, as most serial killers are, but that is just a whole lot of trouble to go through for no reason. Both having to continuously subject Dave to the experiments every night, and having to explain to his wife and anyone else who asks why he's all of a sudden completely unable to function as a human being. No, I think William had a different reason for what he did to Dave, and it has everything to do with Shadow Freddy. So, just a refresher, the year is 1983. William murders Charlotte because he's bitter that Henry has bested him again with the success of Freddy Fazbear's. When he comes home, he finds that Dave has broken out of his room to go to that place. And according to this theory, he was led there by Shadow Freddy. A common theory among those who believe that the Runaway is Dave is that he's led to Freddy Fazbear's, a place we can infer he loves considering he thinks of the main Freddy crew as his friends, and that this apparently wouldn't be his first time sneaking off to go there. He ran off to that place again. I think Dave views Freddy's as a sort of safe space for himself. Safe from his father, sure, but also safe from Fredbear's. Because while I believe his constant state of fear in FNaF 4 is due to the nightmare experiments, I do think he was already afraid of Fredbear's, just not quite as intensely. Let's take a look at the hints Scott dropped on GT Live back in 2015. You know the ones. Specifically, let's look at this hint here. What is seen in shadows is easily misunderstood in the mind of a child. This is probably referencing this scene here, in which Dave witnesses a shadowy figure stuffing a dead body into an empty mascot costume. What is misunderstood here is that none of what I just said is true. This is Dave's father, William, the manager of this establishment, helping an employee into a spring-lock suit. Note that in order to see this, you have to turn around and literally look back on this moment. It's a memory, something that Dave saw in the past. He's thinking about what's going to happen to him if he gets caught, and when he does, he collapses to the floor, helpless and terrified. This is what causes his initial fear of Fredbears, and is also probably what gives William the idea to actually hide dead bodies in suits later on, and is the reason Dave keeps sneaking off to Freddy's. He thinks that's the safer place to be, where he doesn't have to worry about being killed and stuffed into a mascot costume. This also plays into William's bitterness about the success of Freddy's. His own child prefers the place so much that he runs away from home multiple times to go there. Not only has Henry taken his pride and his business, but he's taken his children too. And Freddy's being Dave's safe space only makes what happens next all the more tragic. He finds Charlotte's dead body, probably no more than an hour after William murdered her. All of a sudden, his safe space isn't so safe. But why would Shadow Freddy lead Dave here specifically to show him Charlotte's body? This is the question I asked myself, and it's why I felt the need to make this video. I think the answer to this question actually tells us a lot about Shadow Freddy's intentions and his greater role in FNaF, and it explains every single one of his appearances. We don't know a whole lot about agony, but it can be assumed that creatures made of agony may feed on it. It's like an energy source, it empowers them. I don't think it's that far-fetched to think that a being made of pure energy could feed on that energy for sustenance. Now, in most of his appearances, Shadow Freddy is shown to follow William pretty closely. He shows up at the FNaF 2 Freddy's just a few days after William kills the DCI kids. He goes so far as to actively assist William in dismantling the original animatronics before getting spring-locked, and he's right back there again when William is freed from the back room and comes back as Springtrap. Wherever William goes, Shadow Freddy is never far behind, ready to eat up any agony left in his wake. In FNaF 2, if Shadow Bonnie really is a creature born from the agony of the DCI kids, then it's entirely possible that Shadow Freddy was actually there to try to absorb Shadow Bonnie, or at least the agony left behind after Shadow Bonnie's birth. In FNaF 3, he helped William dismantle the original animatronics because he knew that whatever devious plan William was cooking up was sure to produce a whole lot of agony. He's back again after Springtrap is released because Shadow Freddy knows that William will probably leave even more agony in his wake than ever in his new form. And in later that night, he leads Dave to Charlotte's body because he knew that William would subject his own son to the nightmare experiments to silence him, and boy did it work. William effectively lobotomized Dave. He could barely function as a human being. And the agony just comes pouring out of the both of them. Dave from the terror of the nightmares, and William from what he felt he was being forced to do to his own son. In Ultimate Custom Night, Nightmare claims to be William's wickedness made of flesh. If he's constantly feeding off the agony produced by William's actions, then in a way he literally is the physical embodiment of William's evil. All of his energy is made up of the pain that William has caused. So there you have it. Shadow Freddy is actually way more important than any of us could have imagined, if this theory has any merit, that is, which is up for you to decide. But there is still one question left to answer. Earlier in the video, I promised that I would go into how I think William learned about agony before starting the nightmare experiments. Well, the way I see it, there is only one answer: the Mimic. That's right, in this video about Midnight Motorist and Shadow Freddy, I still somehow managed to make it about the Mimic. So, according to my theory about later that night, William learned of the existence of agony at some unknown point before 1983. And now we're getting a game that shows the earliest points in the timeline that we for sure know takes place within the continuity of the games, and has to do with a robot infected with agony. Interesting. We know that Secret of the Mimic will probably end with the Mimic being captured and brought to Fazbear Entertainment, seeing as how it's in their possession later on in the timeline. Enter the Mexis system. Most people have speculated that it was either created by Henry or Edwin or something like that. Personally, I think the fact that the avatar of the Mexis system is a rabbit is meant to signal that William played some significant part in its creation. Think, if it was just Henry or just Edwin, then why would it be a rabbit? It really only makes sense if William was involved. I actually like the idea that it was both William and Henry because knowing their skill levels relative to each other, Henry probably had more input into the final result. then the rabbit is essentially William's way of being petty and writing his signature bigger than Henry's. So if the Mexis system was developed by William and Henry, then they probably knew a fair bit about the Mimic, at least enough about its programming to develop an advanced supercomputer specifically to combat it. But exactly how much they knew and how is unknown. Maybe they only knew the basics of its programming. Maybe Fazbear Entertainment got their hands on some schematics or something. Or maybe they knew more than that. Maybe William and Henry knew everything about the Mimic. I predict that either through some vague bit of environmental storytelling or through collectible documents or letters, it will be revealed that Edwin personally knew William and Henry. They probably met when he was first hired as a contractor. If I was as successful and owned as large a business as Edwin, I'd want to meet with the people buying me out face to face and come to terms in person. And in meeting, maybe they realized they each had a similar love for their craft and became something of friends. Maybe not super best friends, but friends nonetheless. What if Edwin trusted them enough to confide in them after his son David's death, and he told them what he did to the Mimic? How he had beaten it, how he could feel his rage pouring into it. If we can suppose that William could discover Remnant on his own by putting 2 and 2 together, dead kids plus animatronics acting strange equals ghosts are real, then it wouldn't be that far-fetched to suppose he could do the same here. Edwin's story plus the Mimic going haywire in the costume manner equals agony. A common theory going around is that Secret of the Mimic is actually going to be a found footage game, signaled by the film reel effect seen in the teaser, which will apparently play whenever we die in the game according to those who got to play the demo at PAX. I think this is right on the money. Judging by how Andy Field's character regards the player in the trailer, I think it's pretty safe to say that we're going to be playing as a Fazbear technician, not William or Henry or anyone already named and important. I mean, he basically says, yeah, you're probably gonna die in there, good luck.
Just be aware of the slim but non-zero chance that you could sustain significant injuries while attempting to retrieve it, including but not limited to death or dismemberment. We fully expect the retrieval process to go smoothly and without incident, but just in case, we suggest you get your affairs in order before arriving.
That's not exactly how you'd speak to one of your bosses, but it is how Fazbear treats any one of their nameless employees. And I think that is exactly what the player character of this game is going to be. I think that after the failure of the first 2 teams they sent in, Fazbear will be forced to send in the big guns, us. A technician skilled enough to get in and do what needs to be done and do it alone, and still also be disposable enough so as not to be too much of a loss for the company if we're to die. So we, the protagonist, enter the costume manor with camera in hand. Maybe Fazbear revolutionized handheld cameras in the 70s, I don't know. And our goal is to capture the Mimic and document everything. We'll go through the game doing typical horror game stuff, and at the end we'll succeed in capturing the Mimic, or at the very least die trying. This is a FNaF game after all, the protagonists very rarely make it out unscathed. After the end of the game, both the Mimic and the footage recorded would presumably be handed over to Henry and William, and after watching everything that was recorded in the costume manor, there's no doubt that William would be able to deduce, with some extra prodding, that the Mimic was infected with agony, which is when he would start the nightmare experiments. William would want to find out any and every way he could exploit such a force as agony, so he creates the nightmare animatronics. In the same way that Edwin's rage poured into the Mimic, William wanted the terror of his test subjects to pour into the nightmare animatronics. But things didn't quite work out that way. Instead, the test subject's agony coalesced into Nightmare, Shadow Freddy. And so, the secret of the Mimic is revealed. The Mimic taught William about agony, which led to the nightmare experiments, which led to Dave's death and the creation of the Funtimes, which led to Elizabeth's death, which marked the beginning of William's understanding of Remnant, which led to the MCI, which led to, well, everything else. The secret of the Mimic is that the Mimic is the true origin of everything, the single push that set every domino falling. Or I'm just talking out of my ass and I'm going to be proved completely wrong when the game comes out in 3 days as of recording this. Regardless of how wrong I end up being, I had a lot of fun making this mess of a video, and I hope you had at least a little fun watching it. So with that, dear viewers, I'll catch you on the flip side.